President, I ask unanimous consent that Sarah Sanders of our staff be given the floor privileges.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, I mentioned Sarah Sanders, and I wanted her to come over here, be on the floor while I'm speaking, because this photograph is of her hometown, Madison, Florida, in Madison County. It's in North Florida. And if you examine this photograph of downtown Madison, here's the old courthouse, and across US 90 is this Shell automobile gasoline station. And if you see this photograph just a couple of days ago, you'll see that regular is $4.09 a gallon. And that premium is $4.33.9 a gallon. This is certainly a record for Florida, and it's especially a record for the rural parts of Florida, which Madison County, part of North Florida, is a rural part. Mr. President, last week when we were in recess, I did 18 town hall meetings all over the state of Florida, and I can tell you that our people are hurting, and they are hurting because they're having difficulty making financial ends meet. Mr. President, the Senate is not in order because of the noise in the galleries.
Senate will be in order. Senator from Florida.
Mr. President, our people are hurting. Our people are having difficulty making their paycheck go enough. Our people, particularly those who have to drive long distances and don't have any alternative of mass transit to get to work, they're having difficulty being able to afford getting to work. And it is symbolized by this photograph from Madison, Florida, just a couple of days ago. $4.10 for a gallon of regular gas. And where is it going to go? Well, Mr. President, I'd like you to look at this particular chart. Now, this indicates to us what has happened to the price of gas over the last 8 years. In January of 2001, the price of gas was at $1.47. 7.5 years later, the price at the end of May was $3. This is national average, was $3.94. And as that photograph just showed you, it is exceeded now, even in rural parts of America, $4 a gallon. It rocked along here less than $1.50 for a couple of years, and then in 2003, it jumped above $1.50 and started to gradually climb. And then in 2005, it spiked up right after Katrina. As a matter of fact, overnight, when Katrina hit, it went from about $2.65 up over $3. It gyrated back and forth, exceeding that $3 limit, and look what's happened just in the last month or 2 months. It has gone from less than $3 a gallon all the way up to $4 a gallon. Now, there's something that's going on. And people are sick and tired because they're frustrated they can't afford it. And having been all over Florida, and by the way, Mr. President, Florida is a microcosm of America. A lot of America has moved to Florida. And therefore, when you look at a representative sampling of this country, our state is a microcosm. And having been all over the state in all of these town hall meetings this past week, I can tell you that people's frustration is turning to anger. And they don't know what to do, but they want their government to act. Now, what do we do? Well, I must say that it's very interesting that we hear coming from parts of the energy sector the same old story. Well, we have to drill more. If you could drill more and you could get it to market immediately, that would certainly have some relief. But when that is said, the full story isn't told, because when the oil companies say that they want to drill more and that supply and demand will take care of the problem, what they fail to say, and they fail purposely to say this, is that there are 33 million acres under lease that are submerged lands, 33 million acres of which they haven't drilled. It's there. They have not drilled. And of course, a side issue here is the constant pressure is to come in and drill off of our coast, off of the east coast of the United States, off of the west coast. But there are 33 million acres under lease submerged that are already available. Plus, there are another 34 million acres that are either owned or leased on land that have not been drilled. Now, you don't hear that, but that is a fact. And of those 33 million acres that are submerged, that are under lease, ready to be drilled, or to go through the process of leasing, they ignore the fact that we worked out a compromise 2 or 3 years ago where we would add an additional 8.3 million acres of submerged lands in the Gulf of Mexico that could be leased. We kept that away from the military training area, which is most of the Gulf of Mexico off of the state of Florida. But all that submerged land is there for drilling. But of course, we hear the same old refrain that we've heard over the years. Well, let's drill our way out of the problem. The fact is, that is a red herring to get you off of the ultimate solution to this problem. The answer is not just drill. The answer is alternative energy sources. Now, let me put it another way. The United States has only 3% of the world's oil reserves. But the United States consumes 25% of the world's oil production. If you only have 3% of the world's oil reserves, but you're consuming every day 25% of the world's oil production, doesn't that suggest to you that you can't drill your way out of the problem? That you ought to be looking to different solutions. And I'm going to suggest a few, Mr. President. But first, I want to go back in history. What has happened in America? First of all, we had a wake-up call. You remember, it was back in the early 70s. The OPEC cartel was formed, and they decided to have an oil embargo. And the price of oil jumped per barrel, something like in the $2 or $3 a barrel, suddenly to $10 and a little more. And the long gas lines occurred. There was world oil panic. And we vowed that we were going to do something about it. As a matter of fact, the President of the United States at the time said, we're going to make ourselves energy independent. Well, here we are, 3.5 decades later. It's not the United States that is energy independent, it's Brazil that's energy independent. And in those early 70s, after that scare, when we vowed we were going to do something about it, we went back to sleep. And then in the late 70s, we had another wake-up call. And this wake-up call was the Iranian hostage crisis. And remember how the oil markets got jittery? And we started having the long lines at the gas stations again. And we said, we're going to do something about this energy dependence on foreign oil. And then what happened? We collectively as a nation went back to sleep. And cheap oil was part of the problem. It seduced us, even though that cheap oil was continuing to get a little more expensive. And so then in the decade of the 80s, we get up to the end of the decade of the 80s, and Saddam Hussein suddenly moves on Kuwait, takes over another country, takes over their oil fields. We had another crisis. Oil spikes again. The nation is in energy crisis. Our foreign oil supplies are being threatened. And we have another vow that we're going to do something about it. And what happens? We allow ourselves to be lulled into the sweet, dulcet tunes of being reliant on a cheap energy source, even though it's getting higher and higher. And we go back to sleep. And then we turn the century. And suddenly we have September the 11th. And then we have Afghanistan. And then we have the Iraq War. And all of those oil supplies in that region of the world are threatened. And suddenly everyone is getting jittery. And at the same time, China is emerging as an industrial power, and so is India. And they're demanding more and more of the world oil supplies. And the supplies are getting tighter and tighter. And the price starts going up and up. And still out here on the floor with my colleague, the senior senator from California, as I have assisted her for the last 8 years, each year trying to increase miles per gallon in the fleet average of our automobiles, we're not able to get the votes to pass it. And we allow ourselves to be lulled and lulled back to sleep. And finally, because how this gas price spiked after Katrina to over $3, finally, we were able to marshal the political will so that we could change the miles per gallon from 25 miles per gallon, although that 25 miles standard set in the 1980s was illusory because light trucks and SUVs were exempt. We were able to get to a new standard to include all in a fleet average of 35 miles per gallon, but it wouldn't be phased in until over the period of the next 12 years to the date of 2020. Now, before I offer some additional solutions, Mr. President, why has oil, as measured in gas prices, why has it gone just in the few months from $3 a gallon to up over $4 per gallon? Is the President indicating that I do not have any further time, Mr. President? Is the President indicating that I do not have any further time?
No. The senator's spoken for 15 minutes. I was conferring with the parliamentarian to see if there were limits. There are none.
That was my understanding, Mr. President. And does the senator from California want to speak?
Through the chair to the senator from Florida, I'm the first speaker on the global warming bill, so you do what you need to do. Thank you.
Well, I'm having a good time doing it too. Mr. President, why then, and I'll wrap up within the next 5 or so minutes, why then, other than what we've already talked about, the tightness of the world oil market, why in just the last couple of months has it spiked from $3 a gallon to over $4 a gallon? Why in Madison, Florida, a rural part of Florida, 2 days ago was regular gas at $4.10? Well, part of that reason, of course, is what we talked about, the world tightness. Part of it is the fact that the United States relies on 60% of its daily consumption of oil from foreign shores in places like the Persian Gulf and Nigeria and Venezuela. The Persian Gulf, roughly 20% of our oil supply. Nigeria, 12% of our daily supply. Venezuela, 14% of our daily supply. Now, I have just mentioned 3 very unstable parts of the world. That's part of the skittishness of this world oil market. But there's got to be additional reasons. How about the weakness of the dollar? You know what we could do about that? Here's a solution. We could start bringing our budget back into balance instead of going out where spending is here, but revenues are only here, and the difference each year we have to borrow, and guess who we're borrowing from? China and Japan. They are buying our debt in order for us to meet our expenditures here. If we bring that budget back into balance, we can start strengthening our dollar, which will help us in this overall global market of oil, since oil is sold in U.S. dollars. But the biggest part of this spike, I think, Mr. President, is that we have world oil markets that are buying future contracts, and the speculators are speculating up the price as they bid up the price, and they're not having to put down a substantial amount of money. They're only putting down about 6% of the total oil contract. So 94% they're basically getting on future credit, and that means that they can bid up that price. And so the question is, are we going to get in and start checking out these commodities exchanges? Are we going to get a commodities futures trading commission that will crack the whip, that will examine this speculation driving up the price? We passed a part last 2 weeks ago in the Farm Bill that is now law that will close that Enron loophole that occurred in the year 2000 that exempted Enron and others from oversight in the trading markets for energy, and that certainly has allowed that speculation to go on. So we got a little victory there on the Commodities Future Trading Commission. But the bottom line, Mr. President, is if we're going to solve this problem, we have to have the political will to solve the problem. Now, we have out here on the floor, and this senator will be speaking about the Lieberman-Warner bill later on. There is all kind of inflammatory rhetoric about how this is going to jack the price of gasoline and of oil. But the fundamental problem is that we've got to have the political will to start going to alternative sources in order to break the stranglehold of dependence on oil, and particularly foreign oil. That means we're going to have to go to alternative sources like biofuels. We're going to have to really pour the money to research and development on cellulosic ethanol. And ethanol, of course, we can mix in our existing cars with gasoline and do that much less consumption of oil. And the new vehicles, the new cars, you can take 85% of ethanol and mix it with 15% of gasoline. And just think how much less use of oil. Or you put all of that mixture, 85 ethanol, 15 gasoline, into a hybrid. And what about a plug-in hybrid? And suddenly you have expanded your equivalent miles per gallon of oil consumed to upwards of several hundreds of miles. We have the technology to do this. The question is, do we have the political will? And so that's what I bring us back around to. There's a lot of inflammatory rhetoric about how if you try this new thing or you try that new thing, don't do it. Go back on the old reliable oil. Mr. President, I have seen frustration grow into anger out there as I faced my constituents and tried to give them hope this past week in those 18 town hall meetings. And they need hope. And we need to help provide that hope. And the next president of the United States needs to help provide that hope. And I want to be a part of that solution to provide that hope. And this senator is going to continue to speak out against those voices that would say, no, just do it the same old way. It's time for change. It's time for bold ideas. It's time for research and development. It's time to take the competitive genius of America, this Yankee ingenuity, our ability to create, our ability in our technological prowess. It's time to utilize all of those assets and to break through and have a new beginning. Mr. President, I yield the floor.